Hello, it's Tuesday, November 15th. You're watching The Big Story with me, Chiao Suen. Subscribe to the Straits Times channel to stay up to date with our live news updates. Now, with the cost of living going up on all fronts, here's some much-needed good news. About 2.5 million Singaporeans will get up to $700 in cash in December. This is part of government packages which aim to offset the impact of the GST hike and help people cope with rising costs. The $700 comprises two separate payouts. About 2.5 million adult Singaporeans will get up to $500 in cash in December under the one-off cost of living special payment. And about 2.9 million adult Singaporeans will receive up to $200 in cash under the GST Assurance Package. Now, if you're applying for a new mortgage or thinking of remortgaging, be prepared to pay higher interest rates. More banks are increasing their fixed rate packages, with DBS and OCBC being the latest. DBS is now offering a rate of 4.25% for all its fixed rate packages, ranging from 2 years to 5 years, while OCBC is offering 1- and 2-year fixed rate packages at 4.3%. The move comes after HSBC increased rates for its 2-year and 3-year home loan packages to 4.25% earlier this month. If these packages don't suit your situation, floating rate packages are still an option, and those remain unchanged. Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen has tested positive for COVID-19 just days after rubbing shoulders with leaders from ASEAN and other world leaders during a regional summit in Phnom Penh. Mr. Hun Sen, who is in Bali for the G20 summit, made the announcement that he has COVID-19 in a Facebook post earlier today. The Cambodian leader missed the dinner with the rest of the head of states on Monday due to his late arrival and has since cancelled meetings that he was due to have at the summit. However, he was in close contact with 8 ASEAN leaders as well as US President Joe Biden and Chinese Premier Li Keqiang over the weekend, with President Biden testing negative earlier today. The much-awaited meeting between US President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping has taken place in Bali, offering the world a glimmer of hope. Smiling for the cameras and shaking hands, they pledged to maintain open lines of communication between top officials, to manage tensions and to avoid conflict. US-China relations hit a low point in recent years over issues ranging from Taiwan to the South China Sea, trade practices and US restrictions on Chinese technology. Let's bring in China correspondent Denson Chong in Beijing and US Bureau Chief Nirmal Ghosh in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us. Now, Denson, to you first. Both presidents struck a conciliatory tone, sending a message of de-escalation, a contrast to the tone that President Xi Jinping had been taking in recent months. But is that how you see it? Do you think conciliation is in sight?
Well, Suen, I think, de-escalatory, yes, but I wouldn't go so far to say that they were both conciliatory. I think it's a hopeful sign, that both sides had agreed, that they should manage their competition and not, let it veer into conflict. But at the same time, if you look at the statements, the readouts, of the meetings that we've seen last night, there are very, very stark differences between the positions of either side. On the issue of Taiwan, for instance, Biden had raised objections to what he called China's aggressive actions in the Taiwan Strait, and Xi Jinping, was saying that this was a domestic issue and it should not be used by the US to contain China. Xi also said, that the world, is big enough for the two countries to develop and coexist, and Biden basically said that, the US would continue to compete with China. So, there is a sense, that both sides come to this meeting with their own positions, and we know, in a sense, we're talking past each other. I think this is not the first time that these two presidents have been speaking to each other. There have been multiple meetings, including with the different officials. So I think the positions on either side are very, very clear at this point to both parties. And yet, yesterday in Bali, there was no sign of compromise. Looking at the statements that have come out.
So speaking about the two sides, what about the US's side? What is the view from the US, Nirmal? The tensions and issues are not simply going to go away just after one meeting, no matter its tone. How will President Biden manage the relationship going forward?
Yes, absolutely. They will not go away. Fundamental positions remain unchanged. This meeting was a recognition that the two powers will have to coexist or co-destruct. They cannot let this competition get out of hand. And it was an overdue meeting for 2 years for the leaders of these two superpowers not to meet was in itself unusual and a commentary on the bad state of the relationship, which almost took on a military dimension after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, if you remember, in August. So this was an attempt to stop this downward spiral, to build a floor, as U.S. officials said, and the very fact that they are re-engaging on a broad diplomatic front, on climate change, on various other aspects, is seen as a very hopeful sign that they will avoid the risk of escalating into outright conflict. And there's a recognition on both sides that that should not happen, because that would be a disaster, not just for the two countries, of course, but for the planet as a whole. So there's very much a recognition of that. And the sense is that the U.S. will still continue to compete against China strategically and tactically, but it will not allow they will both not allow this competition to get out of hand. And the fact that Secretary of State Tony Blinken is going to follow up with a visit to China are all seen as hopeful signs that the areas of disagreement, which will remain very much there, will be managed.
Now, speaking of disagreement, Denson, let's focus on the issue of Taiwan. President Xi telling President Biden that Taiwan is the first red line that mustn't be crossed. So there's no real change there, right? How much of a pain point in the US-China relationship do you think that the Taiwan issue will be?
Taiwan will continue to be a major point of friction, for the two superpowers. The Chinese side devoted considerable space to lay out their position on Taiwan in their statement last night. I think the point here is that they want to tell the Americans that, Taiwan basically is not an issue for you to use to try and contain us or put pressure on us. And I was watching Biden's press conference last night. He was at pains, to try and emphasize that the US's one China policy was not changing, has not changed. But I don't think that's how the Chinese see it. He also told reporters, that he hoped Mr. Xi would realize that I quote, he said something like, he means what he says and he says what he means. But if that's the case, Biden has said some stuff on Taiwan that I think the Chinese are quite unhappy with. He, for example, has said that he would deploy US troops to defend the island in the event of a Chinese invasion. So I think all these things are kind of signals to the Chinese that the US would continue to use Taiwan, as a sort of issue to put pressure on China. I think it will prompt the Chinese to conduct even more aggressive military drills or to boost their military capabilities in the event, that push comes to shove over Taiwan. I think the issue here is that both sides are sort of locked in some sort of security dilemma over Taiwan, where sort of defensive measures are interpreted by the other side, as measures that are offensive in nature. So I think it will continue to be a flashpoint, and I think it really boils down now to whether there can be meaningful dialogue over this issue between both parties.
It definitely sounds like there still remains some pain points between the two countries. Now, Namo, President Biden has said that he doesn't want conflict, but the US, as the both of you have mentioned, will continue to compete vigorously with China. What will you be watching out for, given that there's an American election in 2024?
That's a good point. President Joe Biden has a 2-year horizon that we know of, right? Which is much less than President Xi Jinping has, and that's a very real problem. It's a structural problem inherent in the way the American system. A Republican-controlled House, it's still up in the air, but it still looks like the Republicans will control the House with a very narrow majority. A Republican-controlled House will likely be more hawkish on China than even than the Democrats. And you could argue that the Biden administration has actually been more hawkish on China than the Trump administration was. They've been much more tactical and strategic. The export controls on high-tech equipment, for example, used for the high-end chip manufacturing. That is all seen as trying to contain China, even though the US says it's not about containment. China sees it as containment. President Biden cannot afford to look soft on China. That's the key thing. He's now contemplating another run at the presidency in 2024. He is encouraged, the Democrat Party is encouraged by the fact that they didn't do so badly in the midterms. They did pretty well, relatively speaking. And they are looking at more and more measures to compete against China on tech, on a range of issues. And they will continue to supply weapons to Taiwan. They will continue to beef up relations and the supply of weapons with their allies in the region. That is going to continue. President Biden will have to fend off and manage and balance the hawks in Congress who are calling for stronger measures against China. He will have to fend that off because that will come from both for two reasons. One, genuine concern, that is their perception that China is the number one threat. It is a problem for the US. The US is faced with an existential threat. And also, number two, to chip away at President Biden because of the upcoming election, chip away at him politically. So he has his hands, he is going to have his hands full controlling all this. But there will also still be measures the US will take to crimp China's ability to, perform in terms of tech and so on and so forth. It is in the U.S. interest to limit China's abilities across a broad front, while still cooperating, hopefully, and that is seen as a good sign over here, on existential issues like climate change, pandemics, and so forth. And also there is coming convergence on the issue of Ukraine. Now, over here in the U.S. and specifically in D.C., there has been a perception propagated more by China hawks, actually, that China and Russia are close to being allies or future allies. And President Biden clearly does not buy into that theory. I think a lot of analysts feel that down the road, when Ukraine has retaken some of the territory it has lost to Russia, China and the US will actually be more aligned on the issue of Ukraine. If you remember at Bali, they did speak out against the use of nuclear weapons in these conflicts and so forth. So President Biden is left with a delicate balancing act where the U.S. will definitely compete with China, but because of the enhanced engagement, diplomatic engagement, they will talk about it and not let it get out of hand again.
It definitely sounds like the development of the diplomatic relationship between the US-China is going to be ever-changing. Thank you so much for your input, Nirmal and Danson. US Bureau Chief Nirmal Ghosh and China correspondent Danson Cheong. And before we go, if you are thinking about heading to Malaysia for the upcoming year-end school holidays, you might want to take note. Close to 1 million travellers passed through the 2 checkpoints over the most recent weekend, and the ICA anticipates even heavier traffic during the holiday period. So here are the peak hours you should avoid if you don't want to be stuck in traffic for hours. If you're departing from Singapore, avoid the following times. On Thursdays, 6 p.m. to 11:59 p.m. Fridays, 2 p.m. to 11:59 p.m. On Saturdays, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. to 11:59 p.m. And on Sundays, 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. Now, if you're arriving in Singapore, avoid traveling on weekdays between 10 p.m. to 11:59 p.m. and on Mondays, Saturdays and Sundays from 6 p.m. to 11:59 p.m. And those are our top stories for today. Visit straitstimes.com for more news and our YouTube channel for more videos. Subscribe by hitting the red button below. I'm Chao Suen, and I'll see you tomorrow on The Big Story.